This is how you cross over from Israel to Gaza, and right now we're in no man's land. Prime Minister, do you now regret when once asked what your favourite joke was, you replied Nick Clegg? And Deputy Prime Minister, what do you think of that?
Mr. Trump, why should you be president? What makes you fit for the role? Is it just one big ego trip?
Thank you very much.
People aren't sure they can trust what you say. You
Exactly.
say things and then it turns out that they're not quite what you said.
And if we deliver what we say we're going to deliver.
My name's Andy Bell and I've been a journalist for over 30 years. In this podcast series, How Did We Get Here?, I try to provide context and background to a big story in the news by talking to someone with real insight. This week, with the world's leaders about to descend on Cornwall for the G7, it's time to talk summits. How does the host government make one a success? What are the things you must look out for to stop the whole thing being derailed? And do we even need these great international jamborees? I've been picking the brains of summit veteran and senior advisor to Gordon Brown, Stewart, now Lord Wood. Lord Wood, thanks very much for talking to us for this edition of How Did We Get Here about summits. Now let me ask you first, when a government realises, obviously sometime in advance, they're going to be hosting a big summit like a G7 or a G20, do they go, that's fantastic, or do their hearts sink at the thought of what's coming?
I think the politicians get very excited, and the people that actually have to do the hard work have a problem of the heart sinking a bit. It's a great moment from the political point of view, if you're a minister or particularly Prime Minister, because you get unadulterated attention. You get pictures galore standing next to the President of the United States, the President of France, the Prime Minister of Germany. You get to talk about the things that chairing a summit, chairing an international meeting also does give you the both responsibility but also the sort of latitude to set the agenda to some extent. So you get to gear the expectations a bit. All of those things are good. All of those things are gold dust compared to the opposition leader who can only comment about things from a distance. So on the whole, it's an amazingly positive moment until something goes wrong, of course, and then you regret it ever happened in the first place.
Well, you mentioned the people who actually have to do the work on organising it. How far in advance for, say, the G7 that's about to happen in Cornwall, how far in advance would people have been working on that here?
My guess is it'll be about a year. You've got a whole host of considerations. You've got all the logistical issues of how you courier people from airports to the most important people in the world in a secure way, and it's not trivial to get them to a place like Cornwall. Keeping them secure all the way, and the entourage of security and advisors and civil servants from all these countries, you've got that. So there's a logistical side of things. Then there's a sort of hotel, food and catering side of things, which is not trivial at all. And on top of that, you've got the actual substance of the summit. And that really will be going back weeks and months, because one of the things, if you host a summit, you have to have what's called a deliverable. You have to have an output which is remembered. I mean, what you really want in a summit is for the name of the summit to be remembered a long time after that, like the Oslo Accords or the London Summit for Gordon Brown when he was Prime Minister after the economic crash. You want the name of the place to be remembered for years afterwards. And in order to do that, you've got to strike a balance between something that is newsworthy, which will get someone like you out of bed rather than just go, oh God, not another bland statement, but also something that is deliverable, something that actually is in the land of the living. And when you've got 7 or 8 of the most important countries in the world, or even 20, getting something that strikes that balance is not easy. So it takes months and months and months for the leading civil servants to try and craft something, and then to set the expectations in a place where it can land during the summit.
Well, let's talk about the one that you were very much involved with, or one of the ones you were very much involved with, G20. It's early 2009, I think April. The world is still reeling from the financial crash. Gordon Brown is Prime Minister. You're working very closely with him. What do you remember about the build-up to that?
Well, that was a very opportunistic moment. Gordon Brown, as everyone, well, people who are old enough to remember, was having a pretty terrible time as Prime Minister. The crash happened. Things were looking bleak, not just from a political point of view, but from everyone's point of view economically. The G20 was really, it's an organisation of countries that was assembled about 20 years ago to respond to the Asian financial crisis of the time. It wasn't really the sort of premier place in which the big countries met, but because Britain's chairing was coming up on the rotation, Gordon decided to make it a heads of government thing, and where prime ministers and presidents talk to each other. He just sort of unilaterally elevated it really and said, right, it's going to be the big moment of responding to the crash. So what I remember is since about November, December before the March summit, we were spending most of our time trying to think of what the agenda should be. Gordon then flew around the world. We all flew with him in February and March, banging on doors and basically saying, this is what I want you to deliver. He was very, very pushy about the whole thing. And then on the logistical side, meanwhile, all my friends and colleagues back home in Downing Street and in Whitehall were trying to get venues together. We ended up with the ExCeL Centre, this huge arena in London, which was going to be used for the Olympics, actually, 3 years after that in 2012. And one of the things I do remember is that on the day of the actual meeting, the sort of final moment of all this work, when all the heads of government met and tried to hammer out a deal, we met in the ExCeL Centre. And I was standing with Gordon Brown as he greeted every single delegation of the other 19 countries, I guess, of the G20. And for each country, we had a little Olympic trivia fact about their country, which Gordon could use to make small talk as he shook the hand of the person coming in. So, good morning. This is where your prize weightlifter is destined to win a silver medal in the Olympics, that kind of thing. In the small things going wrong lies the disasters usually. So you had to make sure that the small things were right.
I'm interested in what you say about Gordon Brown flying around the world, because it's always been my understanding that basically the hard work has all been done, or should have been done, by the time the leaders actually get together and they are there and they should know what it is they're signing and they're just dotting the I's and crossing the T's. Is that fair?
Yes, that's generally true. Gordon Brown's 2009 G20 is an exception to that because it was a shifting crisis, and he wanted every country essentially to contribute to a massive pot of money so that world markets could say, wow, there's really a big injection of government money going into all this. So that's why he personally went around. He took responsibility for it. But in general, by this point in the cycle, with a few days to go before the actual summit, you should pretty much know at least what the 95% that's going to be agreed and rubber stamped is already. There'll be a couple of arguments left. There'll be a couple of issues between, 2 or 3 countries. But on the whole, the work should all be done so that the expectations in the weekend before can be set, so that the press can all be told, oh, this is a big issue, Boris Johnson is fighting for this one, knowing that you'll actually deliver it in 2 or 3 days. So there's all sorts of little games that go on, but you're right, certainty by now for 95% of the stuff of the summit should be sorted out.
But that begs the question then, why do they actually have to get together, spend all that money to actually be physically in one place at the end of it all, if all the work's done and everyone basically knows what should be coming out of it?
Well, I think that's a good question. I think the number of answers to that, though. One is you need the image. You need to have Joe Biden, Boris Johnson, and the leaders of the large economies of the world standing up, saying the same thing, saying it together. It needs to impress markets, it needs to impress businesses, but it also needs to impress other governments on issues, for example, like Belarus at the moment, where there's significant tension. So there's that. I think the other thing, though, is a lot of the work, the valuable work that actually gets done is done in the margins of these meetings. So as well as there being this choreographed set-piece joint statement on 6 or 7 different big issues, there'll also be a chance for the leaders to meet each other, to have an hour and a half of a chat over a coffee, to have bilaterals, as they're called. So a chance for the French, to meet the Germans, or the Brits to meet the Americans, and all the other things that have been building up over the last few months. It's a chance to have a slightly more discreet bilateral chat with different countries on issues that you care about. And a lot of developments which had nothing to do with the G20 when I was working for Gordon Brown in 2009. A lot of developments with the United States, or even with Russia at the time, happened in the margins of that meeting. So lots of work gets done without the glare of publicity, which is really nothing to do with the subject of the summit, but which is to do with other things going on between countries.
And also at these summits, you must worry when you're hosting them. Something is going to derail it. You may have, as you say, people may have been working on stuff for a year. I mean, just for instance, when you hosted in London, was there something that you thought, God, we really don't want that to happen? Or was there stuff preying on your mind that might derail it, or you just thought there might be an individual leader who might cause a bit of trouble? What were you thinking?
Yes, we were worried about all those things. We were worried about a domestic story that would suddenly blast all our international efforts out the water. At the time, it was quite a difficult time for Gordon Brown domestically, so we were worried about something coming out of the blue at home to undermine everything. We were worried in particular about the relations between... I remember there was an argument between Sarkozy, who was the president of France at the time, and the Chinese premier and his team in the last few hours of the summit, something which we thought had been sorted out, there suddenly became this little row which required lots of side rooms at the Excel Centre to be used to try and sort it out. So you're worried about a last minute hitch between one or two countries derailing the unanimity of the whole thing. So there's all that, and the other thing, it sounds trivial, but you're worried about photos going wrong, and it might sound ridiculous, but I promise you, next week there'll be lots of people worrying about who stands next to whom, and why does the body language of that person look so bad, and why is Boris Johnson's hair all over the place, and all these things. There's a certain audience for whom those things actually matter a huge amount, even though when you're preparing it, you either can't prepare for it or you don't worry about those things. So all of those things are really the substance of what you worry about derailing, I guess.
I remember being at the St. Petersburg summit when Tony Blair was Prime Minister, and the famous open mic with George W. Bush, which nobody could have predicted, which then just sort of completely overwhelmed the last day when George W. Bush said, "Yo, Blair," and you had this whole conversation you could hear next to the microphone, which I can only imagine the people in the teams of certainly the UK and the US teams, and presumably the organisers from Russia as well, going, "Oops."
At the G20 in 2009, this was Gordon Brown's big sort of comeback moment, I guess, politically. And we had an issue that the minute we finished, and we had quite a significant announcement, a very important announcement about $1 trillion being injected into the world economy to get confidence back after the banking crash. And after the summit, literally seconds after the summit finished, President Sarkozy of France ran out to do his press conference, and he wanted to be the first one to announce it at our summit. And Gordon, I basically thought, we're buggered if we're going to let that happen. So he basically rushed Gordon into a press room so that he could make the announcement first as the host. Unfortunately, he got the attention, and it just about worked. But there was a slight kind of wacky races feel as leaders rushed out to be the first people to make the announcements to their press back in their rooms.
Yeah, that sounds like slightly bad manners, dare I say, from the French president. But anyway, moving swiftly on. The other thing I was going to say, you were talking about who's standing next to who at the photo and stuff. At that summit in London, you had a very new and who had set the world alight, President Obama arriving. I think he'd only been president since January and been inaugurated then. Was everyone jostling, trying to sort of stand next to him? And presumably Gordon Brown was pretty keen to get pretty close as well at that stage.
Yeah, it was definitely a stardust moment. It was very strange. We actually had 4 days in a row with Obama. We had a day when he just did a visit with Gordon and a kind of official visit. Then we had the G20 meeting itself, and then we had a meeting in Prague the next day, an EU-US summit, and so we were there with him too. So I think there was a NATO summit as well. So there were lots of contact with him. But I remember at London, everyone wanted their time with Obama. Everyone wanted it. And the good thing about being the host is that you can't get turned down. Believe me, I've been at times when Gordon Brown wanted to meet other leaders and they said, "Oh, we can only squeeze you in here," and suddenly there's a massive story of being snubbed, even though it wasn't intended and really wasn't a snub. As a host, you don't have that problem. That's another advantage of it. Everyone wants to meet you.
I hate to bring it up, but I think one of those moments was with President Obama in the US a little while later, I think.
Indeed, it was a summit. I think it was in Pittsburgh, or maybe it was in New York. I can't remember, but there was a summit when we wanted a meeting, and basically the American delegation, the American team around Obama said to me, "Look, if we meet you bilaterally, we've got to meet everyone, so let's just try and keep it informal." Well, I'm afraid that we couldn't sell that to the British press, for whom the only thing that mattered was FaceTime with President Obama. I do remember at the G20 also, one of my jobs was to be the sort of bag person in the room for Angela Merkel and Barack Obama, and because I speak a bit of German, so I was Merkel's person as well as doing the Obama job. And Gordon had this idea of keeping all the staff out of the room, so it was only the leaders for the last couple of hours and 3 or 4 of Gordon's team like me. And every now and then Merkel or Obama would kind of lean back and kind of wag their finger and gesture me over and give me a message to pass on to their teams. And at one point Obama leant over and sort of wagged his finger, and I went over and he rocked back in his chair and said, "It's 5, something like," he said, something like 4 o'clock. Could you tell your boss that I really do like London, but I really think it's time to wrap up now." So I had to go and pass this message on diplomatically to the Prime Minister that the President basically wanted to get the plane home and it was time to draw it to a conclusion.
I mean that's hosting. You also accompanied Gordon Brown when you were you were being hosted in Italy, and I remember that summit. Originally, it was Silvio Berlusconi was the Prime Minister, which presumably was its own issue, hosting, and he shifted it at the last minute because there'd been this awful earthquake in L'Aquila in central Italy, and it was originally going to be in Sardinia, and it was shifted there. I mean, I guess it's easier being the guest, but then presumably also you get less out of it.
Yes, you do. And you also, I think it was a very smart political move by the Italians to move it to the area that was in most need. I remember we got a tour actually of some of the areas worst hit by the earthquakes. But the problem was that for months, all the logistics people and the security people had done their preparation. Then suddenly it was moved to this new venue with, it was effectively a kind of temporary small village of buildings that we were in for that period. And so that they were a bit annoyed that they couldn't do the sort of scouting out. We were there essentially for Berlusconi to show that he could drag all the most important leaders of the world to the part of Italy that needed the attention the most. And that was really, I mean, we made some progress on issues, but the whole purpose of the summit that year was really for that meeting to happen where it happened. The other weird thing I remember about that is we were all given these little golf carts to go around in. And I remember about midnight with a colleague of mine trying to sort of steal a golf cart and go for an illicit midnight ride. Unfortunately, it was chained to the railing, so we didn't get very far. But you that's one of the other things at summits. You get lots of paraphernalia, like bespoke golf carts or all sorts of strange packages in your rooms with embossed with memorabilia and things like that.
But I mean, that sounds like you got a lot less out of that one. I mean, but you just have to turn up. You can't say actually that the Prime Minister is going to be a bit busy that weekend. I mean, these meetings presumably are just blocked off in the diary, and there's no arguing.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think I would say 60 to 70% of these meetings happen on a certain regular basis, and you make progress on a clutch of issues that are always important, like climate change or like security issues to do with the moment with Russia, for example. Once in a while, like the G20 in London in 2009, there's a massive issue that comes to dominate everything and becomes the thing. I think the other thing about this event is that, let's be honest, under President Trump, whether you love him or loathe him, these summits didn't matter as much because he basically turned his back on them, didn't put much value in them. Now we've got a new American president. I think in a funny way, this is the rebirth of the hope that summits can actually achieve something. So the pressure is slightly on Boris Johnson, I think, to host the first big one of these and see if it can be more than a talking shop and more than the hot air that Donald Trump always said these things were. I
mean, Donald Trump famously, I think it was in Canada 2018, where he just sort of flew in and then flew out, before it was over, I seem to remember, and sort of left everybody, there's sort of pictures of people like Theresa May and Macron kind of sitting on the kind of balcony of the hotel, just kind of shell-shocked by what they've just sort of been through in terms of what they would normally expect the United States president, that I suppose, to be playing the game of these summits, and he didn't.
And you're right, Andy, to say that there's game playing that goes on. I mean, you have to be careful about not being too friendly to some countries. So, I mean, two examples of that from my time. One was the president of Argentina, Cristina Kirchner, who Gordon met at an international summit. I believe that was in the United States at the G20. And Gordon was under strict instructions not to be too friendly to a president of Argentina who demanded the Malvinas be returned to Argentina, not the Falklands. And we also thought it was important to have some kind of contact. So we spent a lot of time engineering it. We agreed that the Malvinas would not be mentioned, and we talked about whether it would be a handshake and what the cameras would see. And of course, the minute the meeting began, all Cristina Kirchner wanted to talk about was the Malvinas and the Falklands. She ripped up the deal that we'd done, and she then did a sort of monologue to camera about how she was demanding them back. So sometimes you can the choreography can go wrong in these things. But particularly, I think with countries like Russia and China, I think what's interesting is to see how Joe Biden, Boris Johnson, not just in this summit, but in subsequent summits, handle the sort of atmospherics, as it were, of how friendly you are, how much detachment and distance you have, how much chumminess you have. I think that's, you need to be chums with the big countries to get progress on the things you care about internationally, but you also need to show that where there are issues between you, that you're standing up against those kind of countries.
I will come back to ask you about what your thoughts are for what's coming up in Cornwall, but just one more thought on, from your experience, presumably you came out of the G20 in 2009 and thought, yes, that you could judge that as a success. Is that how it felt at the time? Did it do you any lasting good? How did it feel?
Yes, it did a huge amount of good. We all came out thinking, well, we completely landed that, and let's be honest, we hadn't had much positive news in the previous year. And I think even to this day, people who were observers at that time, who aren't particular fans of Gordon Brown, would say that was his best moment. We had a specific output we wanted. We got it. It was impressive. It spoke to the crisis that the whole world was going through. So for all those reasons, it was fantastic. Unfortunately, a few days later, one of my colleagues, friends, advisor, Damien McBride, resigned in a scandal, and the whole thing was sort of wiped away in the consciousness of the British voting public, and we were back to the old rhythm again. But for a short time, it definitely, if you can get it right, it can show that you are a statesman. And one thing that being an opposition leader can never give you is the chance to show that you can do the international statesmanship thing. That is a structural advantage of being in charge rather than being in opposition. So if you can get it right, it gives you huge brownie points with the public. Even the public may not care about the issues. It just subconsciously puts you on a slightly different standing compared to your opponents. And I think that's definitely something that Boris Johnson will be thinking about.
One more quick question, which is a lot of people will be watching all these entourages flying in, and the Americans obviously, you know, and hopefully they'll bring the beast. Everyone gets very excited about the car and all that kind of thing. I mean, this must be an enormous security headache. I mean, did you have real worries about security in your time? And were there moments where you thought, oh, this could be potentially very difficult, very serious?
So I won't say where it was, but I was at one summit when I came back to my room and my papers had clearly been rifled through by someone. That was one issue.
Oh, interesting.
I certainly won't tell you who it is unless you buy me a lot of whiskey.
Which country was it?
I wouldn't say that unless you're not even.
We can narrow it down.
Let's move swiftly on. I remember when President Obama came to visit in 2009, with wave after wave of American security people come through before a president goes somewhere. It's like a sort of 6 or 7 delegations to check up on the previous delegation. And what's one of the striking things, I always remember this, is a group of very burly American security people in 10 Downing Street looking out over the back window. And it might not feel it if you're in the public, but you can get very, very close to 10 Downing Street. Even now with the gates in the front of the street and the security behind, the public can get very, very close to the buildings where the Prime Minister is. And they were absolutely astonished at how close the public could get to the Prime Minister and therefore the President when he visited. And they were a bit worried about this. Well, we made it clear that we weren't going to move Downing Street or put a new fence in. But, you know, if you go to the United States now and you go to the White House, the public can't get anywhere near the actual White House. There's a huge barrier around a significant area of it. In Britain, we still have a little bit more intimacy than that, and that put the wind up the security guys from the United States when they came in 2009.
Final thought. If I dare ask you to give some advice to the people currently in Downing Street, I mean, what would you say to them to make Cornwall a success at this point? Obviously, hopefully they've done the work already, but you know, from here on in, what would you say to them?
I would say concentrate on 1 or 2 announcements. Don't worry about the sort of welter of other issues. I mean, there will be constituencies that care about the smaller things, but you want the public to remember 1 or 2 things that were achieved. I think focus in particular, this is Joe Biden's big international sort of coming out moment, as it were, since he's become president, particularly for a European audience and very particularly for a British audience. So have something that Joe Biden and the Prime Minister can bond over and make their initiative in some way that will outlast the summit, because I think that will be gold for Boris Johnson politically, if that can happen. And then third thing is try not to screw up too many pictures. Although Boris Johnson seems to evade the normal rules that if you have a bad photo, it can be held against you. He somehow cruises through all those things. But, you know, the one thing in 6 months to a year that people, when they Google it, they'll still see a couple of pictures of Boris Johnson next to Joe Biden or Macron. And I think having a good two or three sets of pictures is actually really important in this.
Stewart Wood, Lord Wood, thanks very much for that. Really fascinating and fun insight, and we'll see how it all goes in Cornwall. But thank you very much.
Thanks, Annie. Pleasure.
Stewart Wood with his memories of summits past and some advice for the government on hosting this one. If you have thoughts on this or ideas for other podcasts, you can email me at andy.bell@itn.co.uk, and I'm tweeting at @AndyBell5News. And please share, rate and review. Thank you for listening to this edition of How Did We Get Here? There'll be another along soon.